I'm Janet Baker, Curator of Asian Art at Phoenix Art Museum. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Visions of Humanity, 20th Century Chinese Art from the Jones Collection, an exhibition organized by Phoenix Art Museum. First, a little background about art in China in the 20th century. Many of the works in the Jones Collection were painted by artists in the 1980s. Chinese artists practicing in the 1980s had lived through the Cultural Revolution, a period of social and political chaos that caused many artists and intellectuals to suffer or even die because their art was not politically correct. Some artists never received a primary education. Yet they turned to art as a means to express the vast transformation of their society from a traditional imperial bureaucracy to a communist ideal, and finally to a free market socialist country. What is most important about the Jones Collection is it provides a valuable document of how and why Chinese art changed so dramatically from the 1960s to the 1990s. The kinds of work that these artists produce will not happen again, as China has now moved on to join the international art market, and avant-garde art has become the trend. Now I'd like to introduce you to the collectors, Gary and Leslie Jones, whose story about how they developed their collection is just as intriguing as the paintings that are in it. Gary and Leslie, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Gary, tell us when you first went to China.
Well, I had been a Marine in the 1st Marine Division all the way through the Second World War. And after the atomic bombs were dropped, the 1st Marine Division went to North China to relieve the Japanese troops that were there, approximately 1.2 million armed Japanese troops. We disarmed them, put them on ships, and repatriated them to Japan. At that time, the war was over. We knew that when the Marines returned to the United States, that we would be discharged and the war would be over. We'd be out of the Marines in total. So I decided to take my discharge in China, which I did, and I remained in China then until the near the communist takeover.
So, from 1949 until President Nixon first visited China, Americans were really not permitted to be there. Leslie, tell me, when did the two of you first visit China together?
Well, Gary was asked to lecture at Tsinghua University on architecture in 1983, and we then started making yearly trips to China and very quickly developed an interest in Chinese transitional art.
We knew from our good friends in China that much quality art was still available in China, even following the Cultural Revolution. But the great bulk of it was hidden under Chinese beds, as they said, and in the People's Liberation Army compounds. So it was very difficult to get access to this kind of art. Artists were reluctant to show their art to anyone because of the terrible events that have occurred during the Cultural Revolution. We had to use a system that is prevalent in China called guanxi. A guanxi introduction, a letter of guanxi, assured one of an introduction to the artist and an opportunity to visit them in their homes. And in time, after we had an opportunity to talk and discuss and think about the psychological background, the philosophical background of their paintings, why they would perhaps bring out a few more paintings that were of a higher quality. And gradually we developed a rapport wherein they would begin to show us their first quality paintings, and we had an opportunity then to haggle over prices and develop an opportunity to buy art. In those days, there were no galleries in China. There was no place where one could go to observe art. You couldn't just go someplace and look at art on the wall with a price tag on it and see that you could purchase this piece or that piece or the other piece. You had to seek out the artist, and you had to encourage them to show you their art. Artists in those days did not paint for commercial purposes. They painted really to impress their friends with their artistic ability. And that was kind of the conditions that we operated under in those days. The first painting we will discuss today is titled Crying in Silence. It was done by an artist by the name of Hong Fa-Ji.
Gary, what historical event does this painting portray?
It has to do with the Japanese invasion of China. In 1937, the Japanese fought up the Yangtze River from Shanghai toward Nanking. And on the 13th of December in 1937, the Japanese finally defeated the Chinese troops at Nanking and took over the city. The Chinese troops retreated up the Yangtze River toward Chongqing, and the Japanese began to devastate the city of Nanking. During the next few weeks, 300,000 men, women, and children, following the surrender, were killed by the Japanese troops. That event was so horrendous that the Japanese did not even transfer the information to their own people in Japan. It was unheard of, essentially, until the war crimes of 1946. The painting itself depicts a woman made up of skulls kneeling over a field of skulls that represents the rape of Nanking. Hong Fa-Ji was born in 1946 during the height of the starvation and the civil war between the nationalists and the communists. When he was born, his mother tried to drown him in the kitchen sink because she was afraid that there was no possible way that she would be able to feed another child. But Hong Fa-Ji cried out, and his father rushed in and saved him. By the time he was a teenager, he was demonstrating a very strong proclivity toward artistic ability. And shortly thereafter, he went into art school and ultimately ended up in Anhui University.
That's a heart-wrenching story. Tell us a little bit more about your experiences in the 1980s in China.
Dongtu is a very small city. It's in Anhui Province, west of Shanghai. Hong Fa-Ji took us there, installed us in what I know was the best hotel in town, but it was still a little crude. We'd been traveling, and I really needed to wash my hair, and the bathroom was not up to snuff. So our interpreter, Zai Ping, and I went out into the streets, and she found a hair salon, which meant there was a sink, there was a comb, there was soap, and there was an electric hairdryer. And it just happened that that day there was electricity in Dangtu. Sometimes they had it certain days of the week. So I got settled down in the chair, and before I knew it, people were coming in off the streets. They hadn't seen Westerners before, or if they had, they hadn't seen one come in and get their hair done in Dangtu. So the place was packed.
You were a sensation.
I was a sensation. It was a party. There was nothing that stopped them from getting really close and everybody crowding in. And they were curious. They were friendly. As I said, it was a festive event. And they asked questions like, how old was I? Was I born with gray hair? What was I doing here? It was a lot of fun.
The next painting is titled The Recall of the Wind and Snow by Zhang Li, who is an officer in the People's Liberation Army.
Does this painting depict an actual military episode?
Yes, it does. It actually shows a few soldiers from the 8th Route Army, which is a portion of the army from the People's Liberation Army. It's an event that occurred somewhere probably in 1943. The 8th Route Army fought many small battles against the Japanese in Manchuria, northeast part of China. And this depicts one of those battles. The 8th Route Army was notorious for having a number of women in it who fought along with the men. And you will note, if you look carefully, in the upper right-hand corner, you will see a woman there in a fur hat trying to take care of a wounded soldier on a stretcher.
Tell us a little about the artist, Zhang Li.
Zhang Li was born in 1958. He went in the People's Liberation Army in 1976, I believe, and became an officer. And he was an artist in the People's Liberation Army from the very beginning, very renowned for his portraiture. And later, after he began to export his paintings out of China, after China opened up, he was considered by the French, where he had displayed several of his paintings, to be the equivalent of a Chinese Rembrandt. We knew from friends of ours that much quality art was in the People's Liberation Army compounds, but of course it was completely forbidden for any foreigner to go into any communist military compound. And as a result, why we were skeptical as to whether we would be able to get in there at all. But finally, through friends, we did manage to make a trip into a PLA compound in the wee hours of the morning. We went in there and looked at some of these paintings and had quite an interesting time as a result of it.
Yes, it's true. Foreigners were very restricted as to where they could go in China in the 1980s. Leslie, tell us what happened at the military compound.
Well, it was utterly dark. I mean, there were no lights anywhere on the compound. And I'm not sure how we managed to get in, but we went in with the PLA artists. And it was so dark, we just kind of followed each other's footsteps as we were going to where there was a basement studio in which Zhang Li and other artists had art. And suddenly, I ran smack into a uniformed soldier on guard duty. And we were both so shocked and bewildered. I think he sort of went, and I kind of squealed, and neither of us said anything. And I just turned around, smiled, turned around, and then tried to keep up with the other friends. And meanwhile, they knew nothing that had happened because it was so dark. And as we proceeded towards the basement studio, I kept thinking, well, somebody's going to shout after me, or I'm going to hear footsteps behind me, or there's going to be other soldiers coming. But nothing happened. And we were in the basement for quite a long time. We saw a lot of art, a lot of artists down there, but I only took one picture, that of Zhang Li, because I thought, surely when we leave, we're going to get caught. But nothing happened.
The next painting is titled Yellow Robes, and it was done by Cheng Yuan, the artist.
Gary, tell us about this young Buddhist monk's life and training.
Cheng Yuan is a Buddhist himself. He has depicted an interesting event there. This young monk that is shown in the forefront of the painting has a wooden bell in his hand, and he has a small baton in his other hand, and he taps the wooden bell as he walks to assist his memory. He is repeating to the old monks that are following along behind him the 277 rules that a monk is supposed to follow in the monastery called the Patimokkha. He's a youngster that's coming along and following the precepts of the older ones. A Buddhist monk in that sect had 5 basic precepts that he is supposed to follow. Do not steal, no prohibited sexual relations, no wrong speech, even gossip is prohibited, and no drugs or alcohol. During the Cultural Revolution, when Cheng Yuan was 14 years old, his father, who was a famed scholar, a professor and an artist as well, committed suicide during the Cultural Revolution because of the terrible abuse that was being heaped upon him by the Red Guards. As a result of that suicide, Cheng Yuan, his mother, and his sister were separated and sent off to the countryside to work for 10 years on a hog farm. Cheng Yuan lived through that 10 years of time from a child 14 years old until he was 24 years old. He had no educational opportunities during those 10 critical years of his life. And after he returned, after the Cultural Revolution was over, and he returned to Beijing, his mother and sister were rehabilitated and brought back together again. Cheng Yuan's mother tutored him to bring him up to speed for 10 years of lost education, and he was able to pass the entrance examination for the university. As a result of that, he continued his artistic background and today is a professor of art at Tsinghua University.
Such difficult circumstances that he overcame. So, Leslie, what were the conditions like in Cheng's painting studio?
Well, Cheng Yuan's studio was small. It was a long, skinny studio, door at one end, a window at the other that didn't let in any light that I could ever see. But he did have a small wattage bulb hanging from the ceiling with a cord. And he was very prolific. He had many paintings in this studio, and some that he painted were as large as yellow robes, 7 feet by 4.5 feet, enormous paintings. And he or we couldn't stand back far enough to even see these paintings in such a small studio. So we took them outside to be photographed. But the thing that I remember most about Cheng Yuan at that first meeting was his amazement and his delight at how we accepted and responded to the paintings that he had done. We told him that he was a great artist and these things were beautiful and wonderful, and he kept looking at us in a kind of a perplexed way, and it was a lesson in humility for me.
The next painting we'll discuss is Kneeling Buddha by Jianguo Fang.
Is nudity a common subject in Chinese painting today? Because it certainly was not so in the past.
Well, and it certainly wasn't in the 1980s. There hadn't been any kind of a nude exhibition of paintings in China since 1949 until 1988. And in 1988, they had the first nude exhibit in a cavernous art exhibit hall in downtown Beijing. And Jianguo Fang put several of his nude paintings in this show. During the showing, a woman came in protesting against the nudity, pulled a pistol from her pocket, fired 2 shots into the ceiling of the auditorium, disappeared into the crowd, and nobody ever found her or knew what happened to her after that. This particular painting I find very interesting because when you look at it from a normal distance, you're looking at a very pristine and sophisticated nude. At the same time, you should examine it at a much closer distance and try to see how this artist actually produced the skin tone in this painting. It's very, very interesting. Almost impossible for me to describe it. You have to look at the painting very closely, 8 or 10 inches away, to get an idea of how he mastered this beautiful depiction of human skin.
It's incredible. Leslie, I'm curious, does Zhang paint other subject matter besides nudes?
Well, Gary and I were so pleased with the Kneeling Buddha that the following year we went back to Guo Fang's home hoping to purchase other paintings of any subject that he was doing. But when we walked in, all the walls were covered in enormous oil paintings of water buffalo. Some of them, I think, were life-size. And it wasn't a subject matter that we really wanted to purchase. But again, the artists, when they painted, they were not painting for looking for money in the future. They were painting to help their skills, to broaden their scope, to please themselves, and not looking to please others at this point.
The next painting is a small lane in Suzhou, and the artist is Chen Shih.
Suzhou is a place famous for its beauty in China. How did Chen capture that in this painting?
Suzhou is a beautiful town, a very old town, and this painting, to me, depicts all of those things. You can feel that this Chinese woman with her small baby have come out of the house into the lane, and they're sitting there with a cooling breeze rising from the river below. It looks like a perfect setting for a natural Chinese painting in Suzhou. Chen Shih spent most of his artistic life depicting the area of Suzhou and the lakes and so forth surrounding it. Chen Shih came from the southern part of China and was a professor of art at Anhui University. He put a lot of effort in that particular area of Suzhou and minority people who lived close by. Another interesting thing about Chen Shih is that while we were there looking at his paintings, we realized Chen Shih's lovely wife was playing a part in a documentary movie that was being filmed at that time. She was playing the role of Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And Leslie and I were both in that movie at the same time. I was playing the role of Major General David G. Barr, and Leslie was playing my wife in that movie. That was taking place in 1990 and 1991. This painting is titled simply Nude, and the artist is Meng Lu Ding.
Meng Lu Ding became quite famous in 1989. Tell us about how that happened.
You probably all remember the uprising in Tiananmen Square during May and June of 1989 in China, and Meng Lu Ding and some of his art students at the Central Academy rushed out a sculpture of the goddess of freedom and moved it into the Tiananmen Square, and that quick, crude sculpture was photographed and sent all over the world in TV cameras as a representative device for the uprising in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Meng Lu Ding was an artist who studied at the Central Academy in Beijing, and he was one of the artists in Beijing who went early to avant-garde art. Much of his art has a very avant-garde or a very abstract view in it. Meng Luding was born in Hebei province near Beijing. And when we were there, why, he and his fiancée, Linda, we were dealing with the two of them when we bought the art.
So Leslie, did you spend much time in Beijing with Meng and Linda?
Yes, we did, because Linda spoke excellent English, which meant that we didn't need an interpreter, and we could get together with just the four of us often. We usually met them at the Central Art Academy, where Meng Luding showed us his paintings, and he showed us a lot of other people's paintings, and we met other painters there. We even went to some of the classrooms. And one class I remember vividly, it was really, really cold that winter, and practically all the students were in the one classroom because it was drawing of the human form, which meant they had live nude models. And because they had nude models, they were heating that room. And it was the only room at the Central Academy that was heated, so it was standing room only, including us.
This last painting is a very special one. It's a portrait of the two of you. Tell us about how He Daqiao painted this portrait.
Well, He Daqiao had seen us and been with us many times in China, but he wanted a portrait of us in formal clothing. He wanted Leslie in an evening gown, and he wanted me in a tuxedo. So he asked us to prepare a photograph for him when we returned home. He wanted us to be standing side by side in this formal clothing, and he wanted the lighting done in such a manner that the shadow line came right straight down the middle of our face, right down the middle of our nose, and right over the middle of our chin, so that half of each of our faces was in the dark and half of it was in the clear light. So it was rather an unusual photograph to take, but we finally managed it, took the photograph and sent it to him in China. So he never saw us. He wasn't looking at us in reality when he was painting this portrait. He was looking strictly at an 8x10 black and white photograph.
Gary and Leslie, you've had such rich and varied experiences in China that you've shared with us. Tell us some of your outlooks on 20th century Chinese art.
China is still utilizing all of their old ancient techniques, their styles, their methods, their materials that they did in the ancient days, although they are now beginning to utilize them in a different format for the future.
And on the international level, China is re-emerging as one of the world's greatest cultures. And that promises paintings that are still going to be contemporary in feeling and global in appeal, but will always be distinctly Chinese.
Gary and Leslie, you've shared so many of your wonderful experiences with our audiences. Thank you so much for allowing us to exhibit these beautiful works at Phoenix Art Museum.
Thank you.
Janet.
Visions of Humanity, 20th Century Chinese Art from the Jones Collection will be on view at Phoenix Art Museum from December 15th, 2012 until April 14th, 2013. I hope that you will have a chance to come to the museum and enjoy this marvelous collection that is on view. Thank you so much.